Do not listen casually. This message was not sent to you for comfort. It was sent for confirmation. There is a specific kind of silence that surrounds a person just before truth is forced to surface, and you have been living inside that silence. Not because you were forgotten, not because you were overlooked, but because you were being quietly removed from interference. While others stayed entangled in noise, distraction, and denial, you were pulled into stillness so your perception would remain clean. For a long time, you carried a quiet accusation that was never spoken out loud. You sensed something was wrong long before anyone else had the courage to admit it. You noticed inconsistencies where others saw routine. You felt danger where others felt familiarity. You picked up on subtle shifts in tone, intention, and energy that couldn't be explained logically, only felt. And because you trusted that discernment, you made a decision most people never make. You walked away without applause. You left without witnesses. You exited without defending yourself. That decision cost you companionship. It cost you belonging. It cost you comfort. In the natural world, it looked like loss, like isolation, like being left behind. But in the spiritual realm, it was protection. You were not isolated because you were flawed or unworthy. You were isolated because proximity would have compromised the exposure that was coming. You questioned yourself in private because you are moral. You replayed conversations, re-examined motives, and held yourself accountable because you have a conscience. Understand this clearly. People without integrity do not self-audit. They justify, deflect, and deny. Only the chosen reflect. Only the chosen ask hard questions of themselves when no one is watching. And now something has shifted. Evidence emerged without your participation. Patterns aligned without your explanation. Truth surfaced without your voice needing to rise. What you sensed quietly is now visible publicly, and suddenly the conversation has changed. They are no longer asking whether you were right. They are asking whether they were wrong. This is why the atmosphere around you feels heavy again. This is why you sense tension in places you no longer occupy. Once truth appears, morality becomes the battlefield. And those who once dismissed you are now wrestling with the weight of their own awareness. If your spirit recognizes this moment, anchor it. Comment, "I am chosen," like this message. Subscribe, not for noise, but for alignment. Now, let's dive deeper. Point 1. Why you had to be alone for the truth to surface. You were isolated because proximity would have contaminated the evidence, because when God intends to reveal truth, He removes the accused from the scene. Not because they are guilty, but because their presence would interfere with exposure. Had you stayed, your reactions would have been weaponized against you. Your patience would have been called weakness. Your questions would have been framed as manipulation. If you had defended yourself, you would have been labeled defensive. If you had remained silent in the crowd, your silence would have been misinterpreted. So silence was given to you as protection, and distance became your shield. This is why your spirit was guided away from explaining yourself. You were never meant to persuade people who were invested in misunderstanding you. You were meant to outlast the lie long enough for it to collapse under its own weight. In isolation, you were removed from the emotional noise, the false narratives, and the pressure to perform innocence for those who had already decided the verdict. Loneliness refined your perception. It stripped away your need for validation and sharpened your discernment. You began to see patterns instead of personalities and intentions instead of words. While others were busy managing appearances, you were learning restraint. You were mastering emotional discipline. You were being trained in spiritual authority, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that remains still while truth rearranges the room. Isolation was not abandonment, it was strategic positioning. It slowed you down so your spirit could catch up to your calling. It taught you how to stand without witnesses and remain steady without applause. This was not emptiness. This was incubation, a hidden season where strength was formed quietly, where clarity was sharpened privately, and where the truth was allowed to surface without you contaminating it by force. When the exposure comes, it will speak for itself, and your absence will be the loudest proof that you were never the problem. Point 2. The moment. Evidence emerged without your involvement. Truth doesn't rush, it doesn't argue, doesn't plead, and doesn't announce itself with noise or spectacle. It waits. It waits patiently while denial builds walls around itself, while excuses stack like scaffolding meant to look permanent. And then, quietly, those structures begin to fail under their own weight. Someone noticed the inconsistencies, not because they were hunting you, but because patterns always reveal themselves to those who observe long enough. Someone followed the rhythm of your actions, the repetition of your words, and the subtle misalignments between what was said and what was done. Someone connected dots you assumed would remain forever separate. And when the realization arrived, it wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was heavy. It settled in the chest. Because the most devastating truths are not shouted, they are understood. Evidence that appears without accusation carries a different kind of authority. It doesn't seek to humiliate. It simply exists. And that existence forces reflection. It strips away the comfort of self-justification and replaces it with something far more unsettling: clarity. Now, your name is spoken in rooms you're not in, not with excitement or triumph, but with hesitation, with pauses, with that slight lowering of the voice that signals discomfort. Not because people want to destroy you, but because they are reconciling who they believed you were with what they now see. Truth has a way of resurrecting integrity in those who tried to bury it, of reminding people that moral gravity is real and inescapable. It rearranges loyalties, it alters tone, it changes how silence feels. And once it settles, it doesn't leave, it doesn't need to, because from that moment on, everything that follows is measured against what is now known. Point 3. Why they're questioning your morality instead of apologizing. An apology requires humility, and humility is a lowering of the self, while moral debate requires distance, a stepping back that keeps the ego intact, which is why some people never say, "You were right," and instead retreat into, "But was it ethical?" Because ethics can be argued, dissected and reframed, whereas admitting you were wrong is final, irreversible, and personal. This shift is not accidental. It is a psychological maneuver designed to protect identity. When someone replaces an apology with a moral question, they are not seeking truth, they are seeking refuge. They want to acknowledge the outcome without absorbing the weight of responsibility. By reframing the conversation as a philosophical discussion, they avoid the vulnerability that comes with remorse. In doing so, they preserve their self-image as a reasonable, principled person, rather than confronting the uncomfortable reality that they misjudged, misstepped, or failed to see clearly. What they are really responding to is not your action itself, but what your action revealed. Your decision exposed a blind spot, a contradiction, or a weakness in their worldview. It showed them something about themselves they were not ready to face. And exposure is dangerous to the ego, because the ego survives on coherence, on the belief that it is consistent, justified, and fundamentally correct. When that coherence is threatened, the mind scrambles to regain balance. Moral language becomes a shield. Ethical nuance becomes a fog. Suddenly, the focus is no longer on what happened, but on how it can be interpreted. This is why the conversation feels circular, why resolution never arrives. They are not examining your intentions, your context, or your integrity. They are examining the discomfort your clarity caused inside them. An apology would require them to step into that discomfort fully and accept it without armor. Debate allows them to keep one foot outside the fire. And so they argue, not to understand, but to survive. Because to admit you were right would mean admitting they were wrong, and for some, that feels like annihilation rather than growth. Point 4. The burden of being the moral mirror. Your presence forces reflection, not because you judge, but because you don't compromise, and that quiet firmness unsettles people more than confrontation ever could. You walked away without theatrics, without speeches, and without needing witnesses, and in doing so, you removed the noise they depended on to feel justified. You didn't retaliate, didn't smear, and didn't rush to explain your side, and that restraint became a mirror they couldn't escape. People who survive on chaos expect resistance, argument, emotional reaction, or something they can twist into proof that everyone is the same. But you gave them nothing to hold on to. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was precision. You understood that engaging would only validate a story they were desperate to tell themselves, so you stepped aside and let the truth breathe on its own. That absence created discomfort, because now they were left alone with their choices, their patterns, and their unresolved motives. You didn't need revenge because your integrity did the work slowly, methodically, without spectacle. Over time, people noticed the contrast. You remained steady, consistent, and intact, while others continued to fracture under the weight of their own behavior. That's when reflection begins, not as a dramatic awakening, but as a quiet, gnawing awareness that something went wrong and it wasn't you. Your refusal to compromise your values rewrote the power dynamic. By not chasing closure, you became it. By not demanding accountability, you exposed the lack of it. Your calm exit disrupted the cycle more than any argument ever could, because it removed the familiar script. Some will resent you for that, because reflection is uncomfortable and growth is optional, but the impact remains regardless of their response. You didn't leave to prove a point, yet a point was made. You didn't stay to correct misunderstandings, yet clarity arrived. In the end, the most unsettling thing about you was never your words or your strength, but your ability to walk away whole, leaving others to confront what they tried so hard to avoid. Point 5. Why God never defended you immediately. Immediate defense creates dependency. Delayed vindication creates authority. When you rush to defend yourself, you train others to believe that truth requires explanation, persuasion, or emotional labor. You condition the world to see you as someone who must argue for legitimacy. But when God withholds immediate defense, it is not abandonment. It is strategy. Time becomes the courtroom, silence becomes the advocate, and reality itself becomes the witness. God allowed time to pass so that when truth emerged, it would stand on its own, not as your argument, not as your justification, but as an undeniable presence. What people eventually realize is that consistency cannot be faked forever. Masks collapse under the weight of time, and false narratives decay when they are no longer fed. While others were busy performing, projecting, and manipulating perception, you were being refined in stillness. You were learning restraint, composure, and self-trust. You were being trained out of reactive behavior and into sovereign presence. This is why the vindication feels surreal, because it arrived without effort, without confrontation, without explanation. It feels almost anticlimactic because your nervous system expected a battle. Yet the outcome came like gravity, quietly, inevitably, without announcement. One day you simply notice the shift. Conversations change. Accusations stop landing. The same people who doubted you grow silent, not because they were convinced by words, but because reality corrected them. Authority is born when you no longer need permission to be understood. Delayed vindication strips away emotional dependence on approval and replaces it with internal certainty. You no longer need to prove who you are because time already has. What once felt like injustice reveals itself as alignment. God didn't rush to clear your name because rushed vindication still leaves room for doubt. Instead, he allowed truth to mature, to harden, to become self-evident. And now, when clarity arrives, it carries weight. It doesn't ask to be believed. It is simply seen. That is why the defense never had to come from you. That is why the silence was necessary. And that is why, when vindication finally arrives, it doesn't feel loud. It feels final. Point 6. The internal war they're facing now. They are revisiting memories, conversations, and moments they once dismissed as insignificant, replaying them now with a clarity that did not exist then. And with each recollection comes a tightening in the chest, a subtle discomfort that refuses to be ignored because the mind is no longer protecting the ego. It is auditing the past. They remember the tone they used, the silence they chose, and the assumptions they made so casually. And suddenly those moments are no longer neutral. They are charged. What once felt justified now feels careless. What once felt like strength now feels like avoidance. And the discomfort grows, not because they were proven wrong in an argument, but because the version of themselves they believed in is beginning to fracture. Realizing someone was right is rarely painful. It can even be humbling. But realizing you were unjust cuts deeper, because injustice implies responsibility. It means you were not merely mistaken. You acted from bias, fear, pride, or convenience. It means you dismissed truth because it threatened your narrative. Now, in quiet moments, their mind returns to the same scenes again and again, searching for loopholes, for explanations that might soften the weight of accountability. But the emotional body remembers what logic tries to escape. There is a peculiar loneliness in this stage, because apologies can no longer undo timing, and explanations arrive too late to change outcomes. They begin to understand that denial once served them, not because it was true, but because it was comfortable. Comfort, however, is fragile, and when it dissolves, what remains is the raw recognition of how easily harm can be done without intention. This is the moment where awareness becomes unavoidable, where growth demands honesty rather than self-defense. Some will rush to forget again, burying the discomfort under distractions and noise. Others will sit with it, letting the unease do its quiet work, reshaping perception, humbling the ego, and recalibrating the moral compass. Because this discomfort is not punishment, it is an invitation to see clearly, to act differently, to become more precise with judgment and more careful with power. And once this awareness takes hold, there's no returning to ignorance. The past cannot be edited, but the future is now watching. Point 7. Why you must not seek validation now. This is not the moment to re-enter the narrative, because the story you once tried to correct is already collapsing under its own weight. Your silence now speaks louder than your words ever could, not as avoidance, but as mastery. When you step back, you deny falsehood the oxygen it needs to survive. Let truth complete its work without interference. Let conscience finish its confrontation in the quiet spaces where no performance can hide. Those who misjudged you are already negotiating with their own reflections, replaying moments they dismissed, sensing the absence of your presence more sharply than they ever felt your voice. This pause is not weakness, it is precision. You are allowing reality to reveal itself without distortion. You are no longer required to explain, defend, or clarify what was always visible to those willing to see. You are not meant to collect apologies, because apologies belong to the past, and you are no longer standing there. You are meant to ascend, and ascension does not announce itself. It happens subtly, internally, when you stop orbiting other people's misunderstandings and begin moving in alignment with your own direction. This is the phase where detachment becomes power, where restraint becomes authority, and where your quiet elevation makes every former narrative irrelevant. Point 8. The next phase, moral authority without explanation. You will notice a shift, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. People begin to move differently around you. There is respect without closeness and caution without confrontation. Conversations soften, challenges disappear. This is not fear, and it is not admiration. This is moral authority. It is the silent acknowledgement that you stood where others wavered, that you held your ground without demanding applause. You no longer need agreement, because truth does not require consensus once it has already won. What once felt like isolation now reveals itself as positioning. You were never wrong, you were early. Early to see through illusions, early to detach from noise, early to walk away from what others were still defending. And now that proof exists, your role is no longer to revisit the past, explain yourself, or seek validation. Your task is simpler and heavier at the same time. Walk forward unburdened. Stay aligned when attention returns. Stay grounded when recognition quietly arrives. Chosen ones are rarely celebrated in the moment they are proven right. They are recognized, subtly, permanently, without ceremony. Let that be enough. You don't need to announce your power. It speaks to how others adjust. Comment, "I am chosen." Walk in peace, and let truth speak for itself.